I have spent 30 years studying how nuclear deterrence architectures are built, how they are sustained, and under what specific conditions they fail in ways that cannot be reversed by any diplomatic initiative, any emergency resupply operation, or any repositioning of military assets after the fact. In all those years, across every conflict I have analyzed, every intelligence assessment I have reviewed, and every policy deliberation I have participated in, at the highest levels of the American national security establishment, I have never seen a single operational event carry the immediate strategic weight of what was confirmed in the past 48 hours. North Korea has transferred 400 Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missiles to Iran. Not a symbolic gesture, not a token demonstration of partnership solidarity, 400 combat-ready strategic weapons. The same system that demonstrated to the world in November 2017 that Pyongyang had achieved the capability to strike any point on the planet, handed over to a military that has already demonstrated in this conflict that it knows exactly how to use precision weapons against the most defended airspace in the Middle East. Within 72 hours of that transfer being operationally absorbed, those weapons were employed against the Negev Nuclear Research Center at Dimona. I want you to sit with that statement before I continue. Not the operational details, not the strike sequencing, not the weapons specifications, just that statement, Dimona. The installation whose existence Israel has never officially confirmed, the facility that has been the physical foundation of Israeli nuclear deterrence for 6 decades, the target that every Western strategic planner had classified as beyond the reach of any conventional Iranian strike package because the consequences of modeling its destruction honestly were more uncomfortable than the institutional culture of strategic planning was prepared to accept. Dimona is gone. 400 Hwasong-15 missiles organized into 5 sequence strike echelons defeated the most hardened, most defended, most consequential military installation in the Middle East. The underground facilities that Israeli engineers spent generations constructing to survive anything short of a direct nuclear strike were penetrated by weapons reaching depths that Western threat assessments had classified as physically impossible for any conventional munition. The layered air defense network achieved intercept rates that post-strike assessment confirmed as negligible against a re-entry vehicle traveling at Mach 20 in its terminal phase. And in Washington, the senior leadership of the most powerful national security establishment in human history sat around the Situation Room table in a silence that 3 separate sources familiar with the room's atmosphere described as the most complete institutional paralysis since the morning of September 11th, 2001. What happened in these 48 hours was not a military strike. It was a strategic verdict delivered against the foundational assumption of the post-war nuclear order. And the verdict is not ambiguous, not subject to optimistic reinterpretation, and not reversible by any response that Washington is currently capable of producing. 4 questions are going to drive everything I cover tonight, and I want to lay them out clearly because each one opens into the others in ways that only become fully visible when you see the complete picture they collectively produce. First, how did 400 Hwasong-15 missiles transferred from North Korean strategic stockpiles defeat a defensive network assessed by every Western intelligence agency as adequate for any conventional strike package Iran could realistically generate? And what does the specific targeting sequence of 5 echelons against Dimona reveal about the depth of Iranian targeting intelligence that had been building for years before tonight's employment? Second, what is the Hwasong-15 in its original operational configuration? Why does its combination of terminal velocity, warhead mass, and re-entry vehicle hardening make it categorically different from every Iranian indigenous system. In terms of defeating Dimona's deeply buried protection, and why did Western analytical preference for assessing transferred North Korean systems in modified conventional configurations produce an intelligence failure whose consequences we are now living with? Third, what is the Washington emergency session actually confronting tonight, and what does the gap between what the emergency session can produce and what the operational situation demands tell us about the true limits of American strategic capacity in the most consequential test that capacity has faced in the post-Cold War era? And fourth, what does the combination of North Korean strategic weapons transfer, Iranian operational employment, and the destruction of Dimona mean for the global nuclear order for the non-proliferation architecture that American leadership has sustained for 7 decades, and for the strategic calculations of every government that has structured its security around assumptions tonight's events have definitively invalidated? Every answer is coming in full depth. Stay with me. If you find this level of analysis valuable, the kind that goes beyond the managed narrative and into the strategic reality that shapes events of this magnitude, subscribe and stay with me. Hit like. Share this with anyone trying to understand what has actually happened to the nuclear order in the past 48 hours. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them, and they sharpen my own analysis. Now, let us get into the full breakdown. From a professional standpoint, the targeting architecture of the Dimona strike is among the most sophisticated I have ever analyzed. And I want to be specific about what sophisticated means here, because the word gets used carelessly in ways that obscure rather than illuminate what actually happened. Sophistication in this context means the precise calibration of weapon trajectory, warhead configuration, and strike sequencing to the specific protection architecture of a specific target applied through an operational framework that denies the defending system the ability to concentrate its response at any single point, because every point is being engaged simultaneously. That is what Iran executed against Dimona, not a mass salvo designed to overwhelm through sheer volume. A precisely sequenced operational campaign organized into 5 echelons, whose logic I want to walk through in detail because the sequence is as important as the destruction it produced. Echelon 160 Hwasong-15 air defense suppression. The first echelon of 60 missiles targeted the air defense infrastructure protecting Dimona. Arrow 3 batteries, David's sling systems, Patriot batteries. The radar architecture connecting all of these into a coherent defensive network. The Hwasong-15 re-entry vehicle's terminal velocity at Mach 20 compressed the engagement timeline for each system to a fraction of what operational doctrine assumed would be available. Arrow 3, designed for exo-atmospheric intercept of ballistic re-entry vehicles, requires a minimum engagement timeline to complete its fire control sequence. At Mach 20, that timeline is not available. Within 5 minutes of the first echelon's arrival, Dimona's air defense network had been effectively neutralized. What followed encountered no meaningful defensive resistance. Echelon 280 Hwasong-15 surface infrastructure. The second echelon targeted Dimona's above-ground infrastructure, administrative facilities, external power systems, communications equipment connecting surface to underground, access infrastructure linking the surface to the subsurface. The operational logic here reflects targeting intelligence of a quality that speaks directly to the duration of Iranian collection against Dimona's specific physical architecture. An underground facility that loses its surface connections during an attack is harder to reconstitute than one that retains them, because the communications power and access pathways required to coordinate recovery from outside are severed before recovery can begin. The second echelon created that isolation condition deliberately as a designed element of the sequence. Echelon 3, 100 Hwasong-15 intermediate underground protection. The third echelon represented the first direct assault on Dimona's hardened underground infrastructure. These missiles carried Earth-penetrating warhead configurations derived from the Hwasong-15's original nuclear payload delivery architecture, modified for conventional warhead delivery, but retaining the re-entry vehicle, hardening, and terminal accuracy that made the original system capable of delivering nuclear payloads to hardened targets at intercontinental range. The tandem warhead configuration, a hardened penetrator nose section, followed by a main charge with a delayed action fuse, calibrated to detonate after penetration of the primary protective layer, cracked and collapsed sections of the relay, reinforced concrete protection, and exposed the levels below to the echelons that followed. Echelon 4100, Hwasong-15 deep underground facilities. The fourth echelon targeted Dimona's deepest and most sensitive underground facilities with the heaviest warhead configurations in the entire strike package. The penetration depths achieved exceeded the maximum penetration capability that any Western intelligence assessment had attributed to any conventional munition available to Iran or its partners. I want to be direct about what that means. The protection specifications of Dimona's deepest facilities were calculated against a threat assessment that placed the outer boundary of credible conventional penetration at a depth that Iranian engineers, working with the Hwasong-15's re-entry vehicle architecture, exceeded by a margin, producing genuine technical shock within Western intelligence communities in the hours since the strike. The assessment was wrong. The facility was built to a protection standard calibrated against the comfortable assessment rather than the honest one. Tonight's result is what happens when comfortable assessments meet honest capabilities. Echelon 560, Hwasong-15, final destruction. The fifth and final echelon completed the systematic destruction of whatever physical integrity remained across the Dimona complex. When the last Hwasong-15 impacted, the Negev Nuclear Research Center had been reduced to collapsed tunnels, burning surface wreckage and structural rubble, whose remediation will require not years but decades, and whose reconstruction is not a realistic planning scenario within any time frame relevant to the current strategic competition. The defensive response across all five echelons was, by any honest assessment, inadequate to the challenge presented. Iron Dome, optimized for short-range rocket threats, was irrelevant against a re-entry vehicle at Mach 20. Arrow 3 was presented with terminal velocities and engagement timelines that its fire control architecture was not engineered to handle at the volume of 400 simultaneous inbounds. The combination of speed, volume, and warhead configuration defeated every defensive layer simultaneously rather than degrading them progressively as their designers had assumed any realistic threat would. The Hwasong-15 is a weapon I have been watching with professional concern since its first successful test in November 2017. That test was a demonstration as much as a development milestone. North Korea fired a single missile on a lofted trajectory, reaching an apogee of approximately 4,500 kilometers, demonstrating a range capability that American analysts confirmed would allow the system to reach any point in the continental United States on a standard trajectory. What concerns me now is what 400 of them transferred to Iranian operational custody and employed against Dimona's specific protection architecture have just demonstrated they can do to the most hardened conventional military installation in the Middle East. The Hwasong-15, in its original operational configuration, is a two-stage liquid propellant intercontinental ballistic missile with a demonstrated range exceeding 13,000 kilometers. Its reentry vehicle is designed and engineered for nuclear warhead delivery against hardened targets at intercontinental range, meaning it is designed to survive the thermal and aerodynamic loads of high-speed atmospheric reentry while maintaining the structural integrity required to deliver its payload to a precise aim point against a hardened structure. That design requirement produces a re-entry vehicle whose terminal performance characteristics are categorically different from any regional ballistic missile system Iran fields from its own indigenous programs. At Mach 20 terminal velocity, a re-entry vehicle covers approximately 7 kilometers per second. An interceptor attempting to engage it must reach the intercept point before the re-entry vehicle does. Arrow 3 has a maximum intercept velocity that falls significantly below Mach 20. The geometric consequence of that velocity differential in the specific engagement conditions presented by 400 simultaneous inbounds approaching from multiple azimuths is an intercept rate that the post-strike assessment confirmed as negligible. The multiplication effect of combining 400 Hwasong-15 missiles with the Iranian operational framework built through decades of indigenous missile development is the element of tonight's events carrying the most significant long-term implications. Iran's existing inventory of domestically produced ballistic missiles provides its operational planners with deep experience in planning, sequencing, and executing large precision ballistic missile strikes. Adding 400 Hwasong-15 missiles to that foundation does not simply add 400 additional weapons. It adds 400 weapons whose terminal velocity, warhead mass, and penetration capability against hardened targets exceeds what Iran's indigenous systems can produce, integrated into an operational framework that already knows how to employ strategic ballistic missiles at scale. The self-reliance dimension of this transfer is genuinely complex. Iran receiving North Korean strategic weapons appears on the surface to contradict the indigenous development model that has been the foundation of Iranian strategic thinking. But the relationship between the Hwasong-15 transfer and Iranian self-reliance is not contradictory, it is complementary. The Hwasong-15 provides immediate operational capability against targets that Iranian indigenous systems cannot reach at the penetration depth the Dimona mission required. The indigenous programs continue in parallel, providing long-term strategic autonomy that no external actor can interdict. The combination is more powerful than either element alone. Compare this with Israel's situation. Israel's precision munitions inventory depends critically on American-manufactured components flowing through supply chains controlled by Washington. When those supply chains are disrupted through congressional holds, export license delays, or political pressure within the American domestic debate, Israeli operational capability is directly and immediately degraded. Iran faces no equivalent vulnerability. The Hwasong-15 supply came through a bilateral relationship between two states, whose shared strategic interest makes interdiction from any external actor essentially impossible after the transfer is complete. Having spent years inside the American national security establishment, I can tell you that speechless is not hyperbole in describing the Situation Room atmosphere following the Dimona strike. The American military planning community is not easily surprised. It maintains contingency plans for an enormous range of scenarios, updates, threat assessments continuously, and operates with institutional confidence born from decades of functioning as the world's preeminent military power. When that community goes genuinely quiet, it is because something has happened that falls outside the boundaries of the scenarios it prepared for. Two specific factors produce tonight's silence and understanding. Both is essential to understanding why the emergency session is confronting a decision-making environment that no established policy framework was designed to handle. The first factor is the non-proliferation failure, The transfer of 400 Hwasong-15 missiles from North Korean strategic stockpiles to Iranian operational custody did not happen overnight. It happened through a logistics chain that American intelligence had been tracking with awareness, but without the urgency and institutional will that effective interdiction required. The gap between what the intelligence showed and the response it triggered was not produced by insufficient intelligence. It was produced by insufficient institutional will to act on intelligence whose operational implications demanded responses more costly and more politically disruptive than the institution responsible for non-proliferation enforcement was prepared to accept. That gap between awareness and action is the responsibility of the institution I served, and the emergency session convening tonight is that institution confronting the consequences of its own choice. The second factor is the air defense failure and what it implies for every American military commitment in the region. The same fundamental vulnerability that the Hwasong-15 exploited against Dimona's defenses applies to the Patriot-based systems protecting American bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. Washington absorbed that implication in real time and found it had no immediate answer. I know how Washington thinks in these moments because I have been in those rooms. The instinctive response is to reach for escalation options, but every option carries costs exceeding what the current political environment can absorb. Direct military action against Iran risks triggering the Hormuz closure scenario the global economy cannot sustain. Accelerated weapons transfers cannot compensate for infrastructure already destroyed or restore a nuclear deterrent physically eliminated. Additional carrier deployments push more assets into range of the same missile threat that has already forced repositioning. There is no clean option. That is what produced the silence, and that is what the emergency session is confronting without a policy framework designed for this specific combination of factors. The destruction of Dimona by North Korean missiles transferred to Iranian operational custody has altered the global strategic landscape in 4 dimensions, whose consequences will compound over time in ways that no emergency session, no diplomatic initiative, and no military repositioning can reverse. The first dimension is nuclear proliferation acceleration. Every state that has been deterred from pursuing its own nuclear program by some combination of American security guarantees, Israeli nuclear ambiguity, and demonstrated non-proliferation enforcement effectiveness has tonight received a data point of historic significance. Israeli nuclear ambiguity has been resolved by destruction rather than disclosure. The non-proliferation enforcement regime has failed to prevent the transfer of 400 ICBM-class missiles to a regional power, with demonstrated willingness to employ them against a nuclear facility. The proliferation pressure these simultaneous failures release into the international system will take years to fully manifest, but its direction is unmistakable. The second dimension is strategic partnership validation. The Hwasong-15 transfer and its operational employment validate the strategic partnership framework that Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea have been developing as an alternative to the American-led international order. That framework requires only the shared interest in undermining the enforcement mechanisms that sustain American-led order and the willingness to provide each other with specific capabilities at the moment those capabilities are most operationally consequential. In Moscow, the strategic satisfaction is profound. The attention and resources Washington must now commit to managing the consequences of the Dimona destruction is attention not available for other theaters where Russian interests are directly engaged. In Beijing, the calculation centers on the template tonight provides for its own alliance management. The demonstration that transferring strategic weapons to a regional partner produces results altering an entire region's balance provides a template. Beijing will study carefully for its own strategic competition in the Pacific. The third dimension is dollar architecture stress. Oil above $160 per barrel, following the Dimona destruction combined with suspension of commercial activity across multiple regional corridors and profound uncertainty about conflict trajectory is generating financial stress, whose transmission to global economic conditions will be felt within days. Gulf sovereign wealth funds managing trillions in dollar-denominated assets are conducting emergency portfolio reviews whose conclusions point consistently toward accelerated diversification. The yuan-denominated settlement mechanisms China has been building for over a decade are absorbing sovereign investment at accelerating rates from governments concluding that the American-led financial architecture's military guarantor has operational limits demonstrated too many times to dismiss as anomalies. The fourth dimension is the developing world reference point. For nations that have spent decades navigating between the aspiration for strategic autonomy and the practical constraints imposed by American dominance, tonight's events constitute a reference point of historic significance. The demonstration that a sanctioned regional power armed with transferred strategic weapons can destroy the nuclear deterrent foundation of a heavily American-supported ally while Washington convenes an emergency session will be studied in strategic planning offices from Caracas to Jakarta to Pretoria. The narrative that American military power is the only reliable foundation for national security has just encountered its most serious operational challenge. My assessment of where this leads is direct. We are watching the operational confirmation of a strategic transition that has been building for 2 decades, and that the Western foreign policy establishment has consistently refused to acknowledge because acknowledgement would require a fundamental revision of assumptions that entire careers, institutions have been built upon. The unipolar moment is over, not declining, over. The silence in the Washington Situation Room was not the silence of an institution deciding how to respond. It was the silence of an institution confronting the realization that the world it was built to dominate no longer exists in the form it assumed. In 30 years of military analysis, I have watched many moments described as turning points that proved on reflection to be adjustments within a continuing strategic framework. Significant adjustments, costly adjustments, but adjustments that left the fundamental architecture of American strategic primacy intact and operational. This is not one of those moments. The transfer of 400 Hwasong-15 missiles from North Korean strategic stockpiles to Iranian operational custody and their employment to destroy Dimona represents a qualitative change in the strategic environment that cannot be reversed by any diplomatic initiative, any emergency resupply operation, or any repositioning of American naval assets. Israel will eventually rebuild the surface infrastructure. International pressure will eventually produce some form of negotiated pause. The institutional communications machinery in Washington will eventually produce a narrative wrapping tonight's events in language designed to make a strategic catastrophe sound like a manageable setback. But the strategic reality tonight has demonstrated will persist regardless of what happens to the physical infrastructure. The facility can eventually be rebuilt. The 6 decades of accumulated technical capability it housed cannot be reconstituted on any timeline that matters strategically. The nuclear deterrence it underwrote for 6 decades cannot be restored by any means available to the institution convening tonight's emergency session. What can be restored if the institution is willing to do the genuinely hard work of honest assessment rather than comfortable reassessment is the analytical credibility that produces effective non-proliferation enforcement before the next transfer, rather than emergency sessions after it. That restoration requires institutional honesty about capability gaps, about threat assessment failures, and about the gap between declaratory policy and operational reality that I have not yet seen deployed with the urgency tonight's events demand. The question I leave you with is the one every serious strategic thinker in every capital needs to be asking honestly right now. We have seen what 400 Hwasong-15 missiles transferred from North Korean stockpiles to Iranian operational custody can accomplish against the most hardened conventional installation in the Middle East. We have seen what the American Situation Room looks like when it is genuinely speechless. We have seen what the limits of non-proliferation enforcement look like when tested by a determined regional actor operating through a strategic partnership that American policy consistently underestimated. What we have not yet seen is whether the institution responsible for preventing exactly this outcome is capable of the honest self-assessment that preventing the next one will require. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them and they sharpen my own analysis. If this breakdown delivered value share it, hit like and subscribe for the most serious analysis available on what this conflict is actually doing to the strategic order the post-war world was built upon. The next update is already in preparation. Stay with me.